Hi everyone, welcome to this year's Halloween special where I have a special guest. My wonderfully talented sister Sarah decided to come on the channel to help carve pumpkins and also discuss a couple of your concerns that you sent in. I think a couple of months ago I had asked what people's major problems with writing as of late were, and I got some amazing responses. So we responded to two of them in this video. Let's jump right into it.
So I got a couple of responses and I picked out two for this video, and the first one is that the person struggles with finishing things, and this is kind of their story. It's so hard for me to actually complete a project, and it feels embarrassing to admit, so I just have several projects on indefinite hiatus when I have no idea if I'll ever actually go back and finish them. Additionally, I wrote a 100,000 word story last year, and that's the only multi-chapter project I finished since I was about 12. I'm 29 now. What I'm getting from this person is that as they've gotten older, they're 29 now and they haven't really finished a multi-chapter project since they were 12 years old until last year, I think. What I'm hearing from them is that, like, as they've gotten older, writing has gotten more difficult, like finishing things has gotten more difficult. And I find this so interesting as somebody also, like, both of us started writing when we were really young, like we're 12 when we first start writing. I think when you start writing at like a really, really young age, it can be a magical thing, because the good thing about being a kid is like you never know, or like you don't care as much about whether or not like you're good at something. Yeah. I was talking to Chris from Chris MF about this, about how like everything you write like at a certain age when you're like particularly young, you're like, oh, this is like the best thing ever, like I'm gonna get an agent, I'm gonna get published. And I think that's really relatable. And like as you get older, that kind of can stop, or like you're more aware of how to judge yourself as you get older.
Yeah, like I think I've definitely experienced sort of feeling this way. And I think that, like what you were saying, the awareness of potentially like not getting it right on the first try, or yeah, potentially not meeting like the expectations that I have in my head for what I would want my writing to look like. Yeah, it could definitely feel kind of limiting, and it can be difficult to make it through that. And like with my novel too, I had sort of stopped writing it.
Right.
Basically, like when I hit like the halfway point, or like the part 2 sort of break in the book. And even now I'm kind of feeling wary about continuing, just in the event that that first draft sort of doesn't work out. Just like it sort of hadn't worked out in the past. And I don't know, in terms of like things that have helped me through that is just to like focus on the sort of like bite-sized moment that I'm currently on in the draft, and enjoying those very, very small moments. Like even if it's like a paragraph or like an interaction or a scene, looking at a part of the draft that brings me the most joy has helped me not feel too worried about creating a first draft that isn't totally up to the standards that I've sort of set for myself.
Yeah, I think the most important takeaway, I think, is like writing changes as you get older. And I think something I struggled with was like, why isn't this as fun as it was when I was 13?
Yeah.
And like that sucks, because there is like a magical aspect to writing when you're younger. And I think like the older you get, sometimes you can lose it, but you can also gain something different along the way. Anyway, so we're gonna carve open our pumpkins. So I saw this thing on TikTok where you can, which by the way, I'm on TikTok now. If you haven't noticed my TikToks that I post, well, you're very lucky because they're embarrassing. But I wanted to get into TikTok, and so I finally downloaded TikTok, as I feel like I'm betraying Gen Z by not like knowing how to use TikTok. So I downloaded TikTok, and I've been making TikToks, and I saw a thing on TikTok where this really nice lady shows you the best way to carve open a pumpkin. But I'm kind of referring back to what this person had written about, you know, their project. Like it feels embarrassing for them to admit that they like have several ongoing projects and that they haven't finished something. Now, Sarah, do you think that like not finishing, like as somebody, like I know that you are a bit of like a slower writer, right? And I don't know what your thoughts are about taking like a longer time than, you know, what's normal or typical, like, to finish a project? Like, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it was definitely a process where it was hard for me to accept that maybe what the timeline I had hoped to write my book in particular wasn't exactly how it was, like, in reality, how things were happening. And, like, I think I've been writing my book for 3 years now, over 3 years now.
Yeah.
A lot has really changed in my life in that time, and also, like, those changes, you know, it's sort of normal for, like, life to change over time. And I think, like, it makes sense then that my project and my expectations for my project and its timeline would then change too.
Yeah, and this person said that they find it kind of embarrassing. And, like, do you have any, like, I think it's so important that, like, writers open up about embarrassment.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I would have saved myself so much heartache if I just, like, admitted that I was embarrassed. Like, the reason why I did this for my project was because I'm embarrassed. So, like, whoever sent this in, and obviously these were all anonymous, but whoever sent this in, like, props to you, because it's hard to, like, acknowledge, like, uncomfortable emotions like embarrassment. But, like, what do you feel about, like, being embarrassed about not having finished something?
I think because I had, like, a certain idea of, like, oh, you know, by the time I finally get to, like, a certain year in university, I'll definitely be done my book. And I think, like, in terms of embarrassment, I totally relate to that, and feeling sort of like, oh no, I still haven't really met that sort of goal yet. But I think what has helped me get through it is knowing that I won't be able to get this time of my process back.
Ooh.
And, like, drafting is, like, my favorite part of, like, writing.
Yeah.
It's kind of a blessing in some ways that I'm able to, you know, have really all the time I possibly could want with this book, by just sort of readjusting and acknowledging that sort of, like, the emotions that I feel in terms of, like, feeling embarrassed of not finishing my draft. Like, it's okay to feel those, and it's also okay to know that, like, plans change and, like, things change. And I love my book, and I probably won't be able to get this moment back. And I really am trying to feel, like, grateful and excited for being able to experience that, instead of trying to meet the goal, you know?
Yeah, and also, like, that is, like, such a great way to look at writing in general, because sometimes it can be hard to, like, be happy for the moment of where you're at, because so much of writing is like, when am I going to get better? When am I going to get published? When am I going to get an agent? It's not, like, something that happens overnight, writing, and that can be difficult. It can be frustrating. And so I think acknowledging, though, that you can still, you know, because publishing is such a slow timeline, right? I think acknowledging that you can still enjoy the moment, even if it's not, you know, what you had idealized in your head, like when you were 12, for example, can be helpful and healthy. I also think that this person had mentioned, like, they struggle to finish things, and I kind of wanted to, you know, if I were in their position, I would, like, ask them, like, if I were their friend, for example, like, why do you think you have been unable to finish a project? Because there's, like, always kind of reasons that certain things happen with writing. Like, sometimes it's hard to pinpoint, but at the end of the day, something might be caused by something else, basically. Is it because you're afraid of perfectionism, for example? Is it because you don't have time because you're working a full-time job? When you were 12, you weren't working a full-time job. It's hard with writing because you can just blame yourself. Like, instead of blaming, there might have been, like, say you started a new job, or say you're a full-time student, say you got a degree and you got your master's in that time, you know? Like, those are important things to acknowledge, and it can kind of be tough when you don't acknowledge those things, and it can just seem like, well, this is all my fault, you know, when in reality, it's not. I mean, there's still, like, so many, you know, positive things that you did in that time frame, you know? So, you know, speaking to this person personally, I don't think that there's anything embarrassing not finishing anything. And this person said that they wrote a 100,000 word story in a year, which is so impressive. Yeah. Like, so, like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, you've done so much, and I know that it's so hard as a writer to, like, acknowledge that you're making progress, because it's one of those, like, pursuits that does not reward you while you are doing it. You know, it's not like, you know, we both do art. It's not like at the end of it you get like an art piece that you can then sell. For example, getting a book to the point where you can sell it is much more difficult in a lot of ways. And obviously that's like a generalization, and it's not going to be the same for like every single art piece or whatever. But it is a difficult medium to like see visual progress in, where with other mediums you might be able to a little bit more. So I really relate to what this person is saying. And I think the best thing, like if I were to give any advice here, and I'm not sure what you have to say, Sarah, is I would just kind of look at your circumstances now, reevaluate what you want out of your writing, and kind of let go of like the past writer that you once were, because I really relate to this person, and I've really struggled, you know, since I was super young. Like this has been an issue for me as well. So I really understand, and this person is obviously a bit older than we are. So, you know, those are some things to consider as well. But I wonder what would happen if this person kind of took, you know, a moment to like really evaluate what they kind of want out of their writing right now, rather than like comparing it to the writing that they were able to do when they were younger.
Yeah, I know. I think that is like a really great point. Like for me, I used to be able to like write a lot more frequently. I used to write like, you know, a lot more in certain sort of writing sessions, but as I've gotten older and like life circumstances have changed, and like when you're a student, all those kinds of things, like things haven't been the way that they used to be. And so my goals sort of, it's important for me to recognize like when I can shift my goals, even though it's very difficult to do that, because I think it can feel like, but I didn't achieve them yet. But it's not necessarily like a negative thing or anything to have to sort of like reevaluate. And I think that has helped me a lot, like just being able to know like I'm allowed to like enjoy this moment in my book when I'm drafting or editing or whatever it is, without having to worry too much about like what I had wanted in the past or what I expected myself in the future, like just enjoying that moment.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point as well. Like I remember like when I got to university, the shift of fostered freaked me out like a lot. Like, because when I was younger, obviously it was this more fun thing. It was a genre fiction thing. And then when I went to university, like when I first got here, I was like, oh, like I want it to be completely different. I have very different goals. And I had done such like a 180 without like kind of evaluating where I currently was and what I currently needed, that I kind of lost sight of the project, and it stressed me out for a number of years. So I think like looking kind of inward and looking at what you're kind of capable of right now and kind of what you want right now, rather than focusing on what you of the past would have wanted or what you of the future would want, I think is like the best way to go about writing. Because so much of like Fostered was written because I was afraid to stray from the past, and then so much of it was written because I was too afraid to stray from what I had wanted for myself for the future. Mm-hmm. And now we're just in the middle of it, like in the present, being chaotic and doing like my best. Mm-hmm. And I find that is the most rewarding. In terms of like the actual like finishing things, like practical, what should I do? I do have a video on that where I gave like my best possible tips that are also like realistic and might give more insight to this person who is asking. But in terms of finishing things, it's all about setting realistic goals. Because for example, if I set a goal that I want to write every single day for an hour, I wouldn't do it. But if I set a goal that I want to write every day for 2 minutes, that's a little bit more doable, right? Or it can depend on, you know, what you prefer, what works for you. But let's move on to the next one and the last thing that we'll talk about in this video. This one is a really interesting scenario. So I'm trying to figure out how to just draft a novel again. When I started out last year, I could crank out 20 to 30,000 words in a month and had a ton of fun doing it. But when I finished my first draft in March this year, I realized that what I had just wasn't usable. It had so many structural problems that I didn't know where to begin with revision. Pantser problems. Over the last few months, I've been trying to figure out exactly what my drafting process needs to look like. So far, zero drafting seems to be helping, as well as the fact that I'm leagues better than I was last year. But I'm still scared I'm going to end up with another draft one that's too messy for me to personally fix. And that's been really bad for my output. Last week, I started a personal project that I never intend to publish, and that's been great for getting my drafting confidence back. But I guess we'll have to see how I do when I go back to one of my main projects. TLDR, battling with perfectionism and trying to figure out exactly how much editing I need to do in order to get a draft one I can work with. This is really a great question, or a great concern, really, because revision can be like a really scary thing for a lot of writers. For me, it was like the worst process ever, and it's still scary. I mean, it's hard to revise a book because books are so giant. So I think the first thing that we should all acknowledge is that revising a book is difficult.
Yeah.
Like, writing a book is difficult and revising a book is difficult. So if it's hard for you, you are not the only one. Something that's interesting with what this person said is, you know, their draft ones are just so messy that they can't really work with them. And I think that's interesting. Like, obviously, I am not this person, so I wouldn't be able to, you know, give the best tailored advice. But something that I might tell this person is, you know, if zero drafting is giving you drafts that you don't like or that aren't productive for you, maybe you can look at a way that does make zero drafting productive. But if this person's goal, for example, is to draft and finish and revise an entire novel, maybe it's not working in the long run. So I wonder if it could be that, like, you kind of find a process that works, but at the same time, you might need to adjust it.
I think what has sort of like been difficult for me in terms of like revising and thinking about like, you know, a first draft to that leap of starting a revision, and what has been kind of overwhelming for me in the past, thinking or sort of like believing that like my revision needs to be perfect. Like the first revision I do needs to fix all the issues that I see in the draft. And I've realized that revision can be a very, very long process and can be like quite sort of complicated. And so for my book, like I was mentioning, I had stopped drafting it. And then I sort of went in and I revised like the first 2 chapters. Yeah, I sort of, I guess, had an expectation that either the original draft I wrote wouldn't have had those mistakes in it in the first place, or that when I attempted the revision that it would just kind of be like smooth sailing, or like I would figure out exactly what I needed to do. But I think it's been a bit more of like a tricky process for me. And I think that is okay because you can revise many times. I sort of put pressure on myself to make sure that like my first revision is that revision that fixes everything. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. It can just be your first revision, you know, and you can keep building on it.
No, and I like that because, I mean, something I think that I didn't really know as much before I came to school was how to revise, right? If there's something that was like helpful, it's like reading a lot of people's work and then having to learn how to revise it. And I definitely think from doing that, I've become a bit more, you know, understanding, lenient with myself, because revision in itself isn't, first of all, it's a very personal and subjective process. So that's something to acknowledge. But second of all, it is not a process that can be solved with one critique. It's not a process that can be solved, you know, through one method. So if you see, you know, you're looking at your draft and you're like, well, I don't have anything usable out of it. Is it that there's nothing usable, or is it that maybe you need to look at it at a different angle? Because it could be that you might, you know, this person might need to be like, okay, there might be the shape of the story here that is usable in the next revision, for example. Like, you can't necessarily chip away at a story and make it perfect on the first go, like you were saying. So it could be that there are usable things. It just might take more passes of revision to get to the point where the person might be like satisfied with the draft. Structural problems too. They mentioned structural problems. Structural problems are like such a pain. Something I find that helps with structural problems are rom-coms. Rom-coms are very helpful with learning story structure. The reason why I love rom-coms, me and Sarah, if you didn't know, we love rom-coms. We watch rom-coms all the time, but especially J-Lo rom-coms, or like very like workplace workplace rom-coms are like the best. But anyway, since we watch them a lot, I have come to like notice, especially if you go on Netflix and you search up like very cheesy rom-coms, watch a rom-com and then you'll understand what story structure is, because a lot of rom-coms follow the exact same structure. And I'm not even kidding. It's not even that like they follow them mostly, but they follow them to a T, where, you know, girl is unsatisfied with her life or whatever, does something to change it, you know, this person comes into her life who could maybe ultimately help her change it. They end up arguing toward the end of the thing and like, oh no, how could you do this to me? And then they end up, it's fine, right? At the end. And obviously I skipped a couple beats in the middle there. But I have a video coming out basically on kind of this topic. And I did mention rom-coms as a great way to kind of learn story structure, because they are like, in particular, like, rom-com movies, if you watch enough of them in one go, you'll start to see, oh my god, this is the same movie but with different characters in a different setting. And that's a funny thing that I like to recommend to people, because of how, like, they're not, like, I'm not trying to say rom-coms are formulaic, because that's the whole point. Like, you're looking forward to, like, or not looking forward to, but you're anticipating, like, the big fight between the new couple that you're rooting for, but then eventually you hope and you know that it's going to be fine in most of these rom-coms that you're watching. I mean, besides that, obviously, your book doesn't have to follow rom-com story structure, but it will show you in general, like the Freytag's pyramid, the 3-act structure. All of these structures are basically the same thing, but like rebranded and re-explained in different ways, but they're the same thing. So maybe start there if you're having some structure problems.
But also that structure can sort of take shape over time too.
Yeah.
Like a first draft might not necessarily have a structure that is working for the story, and that it's through those edits that begins to take more shape. And sometimes it's that overall first draft that you have, that you can see, okay, what are some of the points that are starting to create a shape, and then is that structure not working because I didn't sort of pad out that shape or carve out that shape, or that a structural issue in like in a book, for example, might be arising because, like, maybe, I don't know, if it's like your exposition, maybe that part is too short, or maybe it went on too long, and that's why
structure it's like not necessarily the structure, it's the craft.
It could be, or the sort of sense of pace, as well.
Pacing can be an issue, and pacing can be caused by so many, like, pacing issues can be caused by myriad of things. Like you said, too much summary, not enough scene, or it could be too little dialogue or too much dialogue, not enough exposition. There are a lot of issues, and these are things that will illuminate themselves the more drafts that you do. So this person said at the end, like, their TLDR was, I'm struggling with perfectionism pretty much, and I don't really know how much editing I need to do to get a usable first draft. And personally, what I would say is a usable first draft is the draft that gets you to draft 2.
Yeah.
You know, like, whatever it takes to get you to keep working on the project. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this, right? Like, I think a lot of writers, are particularly looking for that because it's helpful. Like, if you could get, oh, okay, this is what I need to do, A, B, C, D, like, I don't need to think about it. But unfortunately, when it comes to, writing books or whatever, it's not that simple. Like, it is not really a formula. And so if you're not sure where to go, just call it done. Do you feel comfortable with it done? And could you, like, it done at that moment? And do you think that you could progress to another draft from that moment of quote unquote doneness?
And sometimes it just takes some experimentation too. Like, Like, if the book, for example, doesn't feel like it has sort of a defined enough structure, which is like how I felt with my book, which is why I stopped writing it and began editing it. Maybe it's trying to see if placing a new chapter in between two creates more of that pause, creates more of that definition of, like, going from the rising action or from the exposition into, like, the rising action, for example.
And I really relate to this because I was really struggling with structure and feeding habits towards the end, because I was reading it, like, 2 years after I started drafting it, I'm reading it, I'm like, this is so paced, like bad. It's paced badly, basically, is what I'm thinking. And so I'm like, what do I do here? So I had a lot of moments where I had to go insert chapters. So just know, like, also revising is something that you could basically do forever. And at one point you have to be like, I'm satisfied with this.
Like, this is a draft. Like, I'm ready to move on. To
Exactly. And that's the thing with perfectionism. Perfectionism and writing don't necessarily meld, because writing is not a perfect medium. Right? You're always going to have imperfect sentences. You're always going to have people dislike things that you personally really like, for example. So I think knowing the kind of medium that you're working with, and accepting it, and then forgiving yourself for not, meeting every single standard that you thought you would on the first go.
Yeah, because that's sort of like what revision is for.
Exactly. Well, it's there for you to better carve out the story that you were hoping to write.
Yeah.
So I know, like, I personally, my gosh, editing a novel, it's just not fun. Like, it does, no. But I think baby steps, right? Like, first you're going to want to probably look at the big picture, and then you can move on to other things. The big picture could be, are the chapters in the right order? Do I need to add more chapters in certain places? Do I need to remove chapters? That could be the first step, the first literal draft. But again, it all comes down to what is most useful for you as a writer, because there are things like in revisions that you could just do forever. And if you're struggling with perfectionism, it could be that you're struggling to, like, move past the line level too. I wonder if that's what it is, because sometimes it's easier to, like, hem and haw over the line, because, like, I love writing itself, like the actual writing, and so I can, like, tweak sentences forever if I wanted to, but it can also just be a waste of time, like, so sometimes you have to determine, like, oh, am I comfortable calling it done? I've talked about that in a couple of videos. It doesn't have to, be perfect. You just have to call it done at one point.
Yeah.
It's so cute. So I feel like that is a great place to call the video done. And to call the pumpkins done. Yeah. Is the pumpkin perfect? No. Are there little strings in the mouth that are hanging out? Maybe a little bit.
So that was the end of our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Sarah has such great things to say all the time. So if you want her to be on the channel more often, maybe leave a comment, because I'm trying to get her to make the podcast with me more that we started like last year. So maybe we can get her to get her to come back. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video. Bye.